talked about last time in naming. Remember, first step is find the longest carbon chain and circle it. What's the longest carbon chain? 7. Okay, so that makes this that's going to make this a heptane. And now notice you could just go straight across. That would be fine. But notice also this would be 7. That wouldn't change your answer at all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Notice also that this could even be 7. Still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it still wouldn't change the name. If you named it this way, it'd still be exactly the same as if you went straight across. So if this is our heptane, then the next thing that you've got to do is you've got to name the groups that are hanging off. So this is a methyl. This is a bromo. And this is a ethyl. Okay, so then I've done step 1, longest carbon chain, circle it, that's the end. 2, any groups hanging off, I have to name them, done that. Third one is I have to number the chain, number the longest carbon chain. Which side would I need to start from? This upper left or this bottom right? Because if I come in, see how this is carbon 1, carbon 2, methyl is off of carbon 2. If I started from the other side, this would be carbon 1, carbon 2, and so the ethyl would end up being on carbon 3. So that dictates that I'm going to start from that left side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that means methyl is on 2, bromo is on, and ethyl is on 5. If you went straight across, you should have gotten the exact same numbers. You should have the exact same answer. It's just remember that single bonds have this ability to rotate. So just because a bond goes down doesn't mean it's stuck that way. It does not have to be a straight line of carbons. It's the longest continuous carbon chain is how you're going to figure out what your last name is. So then which do I write first? Yep, so this would be 3 bromo. And then the 5 ethyl. And finally, the 2 methyl. So 3 bromo, 5 ethyl, 2 methyl, because those are alphabetically. So that's the very last step is when you just go to list. The hanging groups get listed in front of the parent name. You list those alphabetically, not by number. If you have to put this answer in mastering, like in the chapter 4 homework, make sure that you put dashes between letters and numbers because they don't like to have any spaces. So the way IUPAC does it is they use a dash. So it'd be like 3 dash bromo dash 5 dash ethyl dash 2 dash methyl heptane. Okay, so there'd even be a little dash between the 2 and the methyl because they don't leave any spaces because then that could be construed as 2 different names. So that's why it all ends up just being like one long word, no spaces. Okay. So you should have, even if you named yours as doing the line straight across, do you end up with the exact same answer? Okay. So if you find the longest continuous chain and the non-hydrogen groups are connected to it, then you know that your answer is going to be the same no matter how the direction of them. So then we'll do this one. So this one that's in this left corner, looking at that, tell me what is the longest carbon chain?
6.
Okay, so I heard 6 and 7. So remember with this, if every corner and every end is a carbon unless the line goes to a fluorine, chlorine, bromine, or iodine. So that's why I wanted to do this one because this is one that people routinely get wrong. Remember, this means this is a carbon, this is a carbon, this is a carbon, this is a carbon, this is a carbon. That line going down is to a chlorine. And most people don't get that one wrong. Usually that one, they're like, okay, I can see that. That is just a covalent, single covalent bond to a chlorine. But now this is a carbon, and that last zigzag line coming down is the bond going to the chlorine. Okay? So otherwise, every end and every corner of a skeletal structure is a carbon unless the line goes to one of those group 7 elements. So that's fluorine, chlorine, bromine, or iodine. Then remember that that line is just the covalent bond. Okay, so you wouldn't put a carbon at the end of that line. So that means the longest carbon chain here is hexane, right? Because 6 in a row. So there is my 6. So now this is a this is a chloro. This is a the second one. It's also a chloro, right? So just go through the exact same longest carbon chain. That's the parent name. Then circle any non-hydrogen groups that are attached to that chain. Name each one. Third step is I've got to number the chain. Do I number from the left or the right? From the right. Can you see that on the right, the chlorine's hanging off of carbon 1? So this is going to be carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this one would be 6. So that means my first chlorine is a 1 chloro. The second one is a 2 chloro. Just tells you which carbon the chlorine is hanging off. That's the third step. And then the last step, I'm going to list them in front. But if you have 2 chlorines, instead of writing 1 chloro, 2 chloro, you call it dichloro. So 1, 2, and then dichlorohexane. All that means is that on carbon 1, there's a chlorine. On carbon 2, there's a chlorine. So the numbers tell you where the chlorines are located on that hexane chain. So if you want more practice with these, one thing that you could do is you could go to Chem 130, go to the Moodle page. You can print, or you don't really even have to print, but you could just download the active PowerPoint. This active PowerPoint is the blank PowerPoints, so it doesn't have any of the answers written on it. Now you've got all of these practice sheets, okay? So you could just download it onto your computer, go to the page where you have to practice doing some naming, sit down and do the naming. You want to check if what you did is correct. You don't even have to go to your own notes. You can go to the exam 2 module. Do you see the chapter 4 marked up PowerPoint? That's the PowerPoint that I'm doing right now. So I have like the blank PowerPoint, and then I have all of the answers in the marked up PowerPoint. So you could check yourself to practice, to go back through. Can I find the longest carbon chain? Can I name it? Can I go through and name those non-hydrogen groups? Can I put them in order by numbering that longest carbon chain? So this is a way for you to go back and like just practice what we've been doing in class just by using the stuff that's posted in Moodle. Anytime you miss a class, like if you missed the last class, this is the last class. I post the lectures, they're recording right now. I post those lectures, so if you click on that, that's a YouTube video. Okay, so also if you're like, I can't remember how to do this, you could go back and find the lecture. I didn't list them by dates. I did list them by topic though. So this is like last Thursdays, and then going up here, that would be last Tuesdays. And then the lecture going here, that would be the Thursday before. I put them all in order. And then I also post, like, there's the chapter 3 marked up PowerPoint. So like if you wanted to practice drawing covalent molecules, figuring out geometry, you can always go and check. The answers are all posted there. If you wanted to practice like naming ionic and covalent, if you're like, I still feel kind of iffy, this is the one that has all of the answers. And then all you've got to do is go up to the chapter 3 active PowerPoint, which is in the PowerPoints for printing module. That's the blank ones. So that's got all of the questions, and then the marked up one has all of the answers. So that would be a good place if you feel like you need extra practice, instead of being like, well, I don't know, I have all the answers, I don't know how to practice. Yes, you do. There's lots of them to practice here. So if you get to where you can go through and fill out those practice pages that I have in the PowerPoint slides, then you should feel pretty comfortable for next week. So next week is this exam. It's over chapters 3 and 4. I did put out a note card. Remember that you can use one side of a note card. So things like you might want to put like those polyatomic ion formula and name. Maybe like an example of how you actually name it, an example of how you figure out the formula. Same thing with ionic. Remember the special transition metals, which are iron, chromium, and copper, that you have to use those Roman numerals. So those kinds of rules that we did last time as you're going through and trying to practice these, finishing your mastering assignments. If you find any that you're like, I'm not sure, 100% sure I can do this, add yourself an example, okay? I wouldn't fill out the note card straight away. I would start a list. Start a list on another piece of paper for chapter 3. These are like the things that I think I'm going to have to either practice a whole lot more or I'm going to need it on the note card, okay? So that I can figure it out. It's got to be meaningful. What you put on the note card can't just be everything. It's got to be something that's going to help trigger how to do, answer, name, or draw a structure, because that's really what a whole lot of this is. So here's the next one. So remember last time we did the naming of molecules if given the skeletal, Lewis, or condensed structural formula. So now if you have the name and you want to draw them, what do you do first? So 3-ethylhexane, what do you put down first? If I have 3-ethylhexane, how am I going to put down the hexane, right? Because this tells me how many carbons in the chain. So I know now that I've got to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I know that I got to put 6 carbons because hexane is the parent. That tells you the longest carbon chain. In a way, I think this is easier because you can put them straight in a row. So you know the longest carbon chain is in this nice straight in a row. You don't have to go around corners or anything like that. Remember that carbon always has 4 covalent bonds. For all of the ones that we're naming, there's always going to be 4. They're all 4 single covalent bonds. So remember that when I make my chain of 6, there will always be bonds up, down, and on the ends. Anything that doesn't have a non-hydrogen group is going to be a what? On the ends of all of those dashes. Hydrogens, right? So all of the ends of those will be hydrogens except the non-hanging group. And my non-hanging group, my non-hydrogen hanging group is an ethyl. So it's on carbon number what? 3, right? So you can number or you can just count across, especially with one that's only a single group, right? So remember that this would be carbons 1 through 6, 6 carbons, that makes it a hexane. Those red numbers are just numbering the chain. That's all that's helping you to do is just figure out which carbon on the chain. So I'm going to put in ethyl hanging off of carbon 3, and an ethyl is what's that one? Methyl is CH3, so ethyl is 2 carbons, right? So it's a 2 carbon group. Remember, meth means 1 carbon, eth means 2. So an ethyl is a 2 carbon group. Now also remember that those carbons also have to have 4 bonds. They're all going to have single bonds, so they'll have a dash to the left and right, above and below. Is that it? I don't have any others. I put an ethyl off of carbon 3, so that's all the non-hydrogen groups. So all those empty dashes are all hydrogens, okay? So you can go in and put hydrogens on every single one of those little dashes. There's a hydrogen, hydrogen, hydrogen. And this is the Lewis structure, because the Lewis structure shows every single bond. You could shorten this a little bit by doing the condensed structural formula. Remember, the condensed structural formula lists each carbon and what's arranged around it. And if there's a non-hydrogen group, you either drop it down or put it above in your straight line. So carbon number 1 you would call what? If it was a condensed structural formula, carbon number 1 has how many hydrogens? 3. So carbon 1 would be CH3. Carbon 2, CH2. Carbon 3 would be how many hydrogens around it? Just 1. So carbon number 3 would be CH. Then you would put a line coming down to a CH2, CH3. Can you see that's the ethyl? A carbon with 2 hydrogens linked to a carbon with 3 hydrogens. That's the ethyl group. So it would just be written underneath. Carbon number 4 is the CH2. Carbon number 5, CH2. And then the last one, CH3. So some people like doing that. because it sort of doesn't show, it doesn't split it out so much. It doesn't show all those bonds. It just shows the longest carbon chain and then the group that's hanging off. The last one, though, is some people like to do a skeletal structure. So if I was going to draw a skeletal structure for hexane, how many zigzag lines would I need? 5, because remember that it's just the bonds between carbons. If I look at that Lewis structure, do you see that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines? The bonds between carbons in the chain, 6 carbons, 5 lines. So I would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's my zigzag. Carbons on every end, carbons at every corner. And then I have to add an ethyl. So what's an ethyl going to look like? A methyl, remember, it looks like a little line just sticking out. So an ethyl would be with a bend. So it'd be kind of like a line with the bend. Some people say it looks almost like an L sticking off. And I'd have to count. Remember that carbon 1 would be on this left end. Carbon 2 would be that first top point. Carbon 3 then would come down and have a bend. Remember that every bend and every end, unless it's going to a halogen, is going to be a carbon. Okay, so what about 1-bromo, 3-iodo-cyclopentane? So you look at it and you're like, what? Okay, so what do you do first? What am I going to need to do first? Okay, it's a pentane, but what's in front of pentane? So that's part of the parent name. Remember that if you see a ring, that is part of the parent name. So I have to name this, not just pentane, but because the cyclo's in front, cyclo tells me to make my 5 carbons in a circle, right? So this is the house. So I have to do this ring of 5. So carbon, 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 carbon. Okay? So that is my cyclopentane. So if you see cyclo, that tells you to put whatever the number in that pentane, hexane, octane, put it in a ring. Now, each of these carbons is going to have how many other bonds? 2, because they all have to have how many? Remember that carbon always has 4 covalent bonds. Do you see that every carbon in this way has 2 right now? So each carbon has 2 lines already connected. So I know that this carbon, this carbon, this carbon, this carbon, this one, that they're all going to have 2 additional. So if I don't put a non-hydrogen group, these are all going to be what? They're all going to be hydrogens, just like we did with the previous one. So you start with your chain. You should have lines up, down, left, and right if it's a straight chain. But if it's a ring, then every carbon is connected to 2 carbons. So that means I'm going to have 2 dashes sticking off. So they should always have 4. Okay, so now 1-bromo, 3-iodo. Where do I put the bromine? Is it defined or do you get to choose? You really get to choose. I can put the bromine anywhere. Wherever I put the bromine, that's carbon 1. Okay? Because remember, this is like not stuck. I could twist this. So if I put the bromine that's sticking off of the top, well, I could twist that molecule and have it look like it's sticking off the bottom. But that's going to be carbon number 1. So wherever I put carbon 1, I'm going to put it here. That's where my bromine goes. Now, how do I know where to put the iodine? It goes on carbon number 3. And so, again, you get to choose. Do you want to count clockwise or do you want to count counterclockwise? It'll be the same molecule. I could take, if I number it clockwise when I get done, I could flip the molecule upside down and it would look just like I did a counterclockwise counting. So either way, it doesn't matter. I'll just go clockwise because that's kind of me. Do you see that that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then this one would be 5. So that tells me to put the iodine on carbon number 3. And the iodo is just an iodine. So chloro, just a chlorine. Make sure you put Cl, not just C. Fluorine is an F, not FL. That is Florida. Okay, so you want to remember that fluoro is just an F. Everybody does that. Every single test, I have somebody that puts FL. Okay, but fluorine, there is no FL on the periodic table. It's just an F. But if you have any of those halogens, fluorine, chlorine, bromine, or iodine, you just hang it off of whichever carbon it comes in front of it in terms of its number. So is that it? I don't have anything else to add except what? A whole bunch of hydrogens. So then that means this is an H, this is an H, this is an H, this is an H. They get quite exhaustive after a while. Okay? That's a Lewis structure. Lewis structure shows you all of the bonds. Shows every carbon has 4 bonds. You don't leave any lines out. But if you wanted the condensed structural formula for this, what would carbon number 1, how many hydrogens does carbon number 1 have around it? So it would be just CH with a Br sticking off. And then go into carbon number 2, how many hydrogens? CH2. Then coming down, carbon number 3, CH with an iodine coming off. And then CH2, carbon number 4, and carbon number 5, also a CH2, and then linked back to carbon number 1. Can you see the same? When you do the condensed structural formula, you just list after the carbon how many individual hydrogens are directly connected to it. No. In fact, on the exam, you can do any of those. You can do a Lewis structure, you could do a skeletal structure, you can do the condensed structural formula. I'm just showing you how they look because I think that helps when you have to go name them. Like recognizing those are the exact same molecules. One is written with all of its bonds, one is written as a condensed structural formula so that you kind of see that those are the same thing. Now, what if I was going to do a skeletal structure for this? How would I start? I would just do the house, right? So skeletal structure does not put any hydrogens or carbons, but every carbon is represented by a corner or an end. So I would just take and do my 5-sided pentagon. That's not too bad. The one last night, it looked like the roof was caving in. That was terrible. Okay, and then where would I put the bromine? Kind of sticking off of this upper right. So we'd have a Br. And where would I put the iodine? Sticking off of the other one. All 3 of those are the exact same molecule. They're just drawn differently. Drawn like kind of shorter and shorter and shorter ways. It really, those skeletal structures become very, very helpful when you have huge molecules because writing all those carbons and hydrogens gets super old and takes a lot of time and takes up a lot of space. All right, last one, 1,2-dichloropropane. What do I do first? I put down, which is, how many carbons? Meth is 1, eth is 2, prop is 3. So propane, 3 carbons. Remember that if it's a Lewis structure, there's going to be a bond above, a bond below, to the left and the right, with all the straight chains. So it's 1,2-dichloro. So that means that I put a chlorine on carbon 1 and a chlorine on carbon 2. Does it matter if I put the chlorine on the end and sticking up off of one and the chlorine sticking up off of carbon 2? No. All that matters is that the chlorine is attached to an end carbon and a middle carbon. It would not be wrong if you put it on the right carbon, because then you would just say you're numbering from the right side. But you would have to have one on an end carbon anywhere. So like I could do this. I could put my chlorine over here. Do you see that that wouldn't be any different? Because I could take this molecule, flip it around, rotate the bonds, and put the chlorine right back where I had it. That would still be 1, 2. I could put the chlorine that's sticking off the middle carbon pointed up. Still would be the same thing. So that's it. What are all those dashes then? All the empty dashes are hydrogens. If you're going to draw a Lewis structure, you need to put them in, okay? But if you were going to draw a skeletal structure, then you never put them in, right? Because then you don't put the carbons either. So a lot of people like skeletal structures. You just need to make sure that you're careful in counting when you do your zigzag. Like, don't go over and don't have too many, too few. If I was going to do this as a condensed structural formula, the first carbon over here would be, the left carbon we'll say, would be a 3H3. Then it would be connected to a CH, and then hanging off is a chlorine, and then the last one, It's a CH2. Do you see that? Do you see that my right carbon has 2 hydrogens? So that last one would be a CH2 and then a chlorine sticking off of it. So non-hydrogen groups, typically you put below or above. You don't usually put them on the end just because you end up with an H on the end. So you usually hang them down or put them up. I mean, technically it wouldn't be wrong if you stuck it off at the end. This one's really strange, but if I was going to do a skeletal structure for this, how many lines? 2. That looks terrible. Straight. Well, that's as straight as you get. Okay, that's all it would be. And then you would just hang a chlorine off of the middle carbon and a chlorine off of the bottom carbon, or one end carbon. That would be it. It's very odd looking, but that would be 1,2-dichloropropane. Okay, so hopefully that kind of helps. And like, one, I like to do these because I like you to kind of like visually think about condensed structural formulas versus a Lewis structure versus a skeletal structure. Kind of like think about how all 3 of them are similar, just different ways of drawing the same molecule. And then we started, and hopefully everybody grabbed one, we started talking about functional groups. So functional groups are non-carbon hydrogen groups or that don't have just those single bonds. So in here, I will tell you that you get this on the exam. So you do not have to spend time writing the functional groups on your note card. You get this and a periodic table when you take the exam. The important thing is you need to just know like how to use this. Like, what does this mean? What are these little like structures telling you? And so we started going through the very first ones. These ones are in your e-text and they're kind of interesting. They're just so darn small. If they would like make them bigger, that would be helpful. So that's why I really don't use them. I just go through and I made like a separate chart where at least they look bigger. So remember, we talked about these ones first. And these ones, the ones that are just carbons, are actually listed like the very top of your card. And the first one are just different bonding arrangements that carbons can have. We have been naming everything with the ending ANE, right? So we have propane, we have octane, cyclohexane. So everything ends in ANE. ANE endings are all single carbon-to-carbon bonds. So notice that that's the very first one. So if you just had a single chain of carbons, you would say, oh, that's an alkane, okay? But if there's a double bond, double bonds exist between carbon atoms. Double bonds tend to be a little more reactive, a little less strong than, not necessarily strong, but I guess reactive. They tend to break more than single bonds do. But if you see those, then the ending on the name of that molecule is that it's an alkene. So they use an E to represent the fact that there's a double bond. So you see that on the top of the card. Then the last one we talked about that are just straight chains is you can have a triple bond. So a triple bond is an alkyne with a Y. Then we talked about the aromatics, so the 6-membered ring. So you can also have these unique arrangements of carbon where you have 6 carbons and they're alternating single and double bonds. So you might see it drawn so that the double bond is in the upper left. You might see it drawn where the double bond starts in the upper right. They're considered the exact same because remember, you could flip this molecule around. In fact, the molecules, the double bonds are stabilized by having those single bonds. This is a more stable molecule than an alkene is. They call these aromatics. They got their names because they were kind of smelly. So they're aromatic in terms of their smell. These are just the different ways that you might see an aromatic drawn. I try to draw the alternating single and double bonds with the little hexagon shape, but just know sometimes in your textbook, you'll see it look like this shape and they'll just put a circle inside. So that's also depicting that aromatic shape. So I put the aromatic in the upper right corner. So then we got to these. And this is pretty much like where we stopped. So when you look at a molecule, You might have one functional group, you might have two. We're going to do one next that has 9. Okay, so they might have a whole bunch of them. And the big trick is, what am I looking for to pick out these differences? So the alcohol. Alcohols, you can recognize if there's an OH attached to a carbon that has nothing but carbons and hydrogens attached to it. So in this, the carbon has no nitrogens or oxygens, just the OH. So we could have this one, which is ethanol, so ethyl alcohol. You could also have this OH like hanging off of the middle. So it's not necessarily just on an end. So notice in these condensed structural formulas, end carbons typically have 3 hydrogens, middle carbons have 2. So you should be able to kind of count how there's 4 bonds that are there. So it could have that OH. That is actually isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol, that CH3, CHOH, CH3. But notice that the carbon that it's attached to, the OH is attached to a carbon that is attached to nothing but carbons and hydrogen. Aldehyde and carboxylic acids are special. They're always on the end of a molecule. So they're always hanging off of an end. They're never going to be in the middle of a chain. So if you have like a molecule with a bunch of branches and you see these double bond oxygens on the end, they're either an aldehyde or a carboxylic acid. If there's only one oxygen with the double bond, then you know that it is an aldehyde. If there's 2 oxygens, one will have a double bond, the other will be an OH hanging off. So sort of 2 oxygens hanging off of one carbon at an end, then that's the carboxylic acid. So you have to kind of practice saying the names. Aldehyde, carboxylic acid is the other one. That's the hardest one for people to be able to say and pronounce, but just think like carbox and then ilic in terms of its name. These bottom 2, the bottom 2 are the only ones that have nitrogen. So if you see a nitrogen in a molecule, to tell an amine from an amide, they both sound very similar. Amines and amides are the only ones that have the nitrogens. It's an amine if the nitrogen is attached to a carbon that doesn't have any oxygens attached. So notice in that first one, so CH3, CH2, CH2, and then an NH2 at the end. So when I look at this carbon, I'm looking, does that carbon have an oxygen? If it doesn't, it's an amine. But in this one, when I see this nitrogen here, I look at this carbon and I see it has an oxygen connected. That makes it an amide. And in fact, amides, the nitrogen's attached to a carbon that has a double bond oxygen. This one, I will tell you, is always going to be in the middle of a chain. You will never have that one like on an end. So you'll find that one in the middle. Amides, these are the bonds between amino acids and proteins. So take a minute, look at your little handout. Do you see where the amine is and the amide? And notice the difference, that amide has a double bond oxygen on the carbon that the nitrogen's connected to, whereas an amine is not going to. Okay? The bottom 2 are really pretty simple ones. If you ever see a sulfur, doesn't matter if the sulfur is attached to a carbon or if it's attached to a hydrogen, if there's a sulfur in the group, it's always called a thiol. Sometimes you can actually have a disulfide where 2 sulfurs are connected, still a thiol. Okay, we're just going to call it a thiol, and I will tell you that thiols are common in proteins. There's certain amino acids that contain sulfur in protein. They're in high concentration in egg white. And so if you've ever boiled eggs and you boil them too long, when you open up the egg, what color is the yolk? It's not yellow, it's kind of got Do you notice it gets like a greenish kind of color around the outside edge? That just means you way overcooked it. And you'll notice that it'll have a really stronger, they say like a stronger egg smell. That is because of the breakdown of sulfur amino acids in the egg. So if you cook your eggs so that the yolks are just done and still just yellow, no green to the outside edges of them, you'll notice they don't have quite as much of an egg smell to them. Just a cooking note for you. But that's because there's thiols in the proteins for egg whites. Phenols. Phenols are the other one. Phenols look a lot like an aromatic. So if you see a 6-membered ring, alternating single and double bonds, to tell a phenol from an aromatic, look for an OH. So just look at every corner of the aromatic and look to see, is there an OH hanging off? If there's an OH hanging off, and it doesn't have to be hanging off of the right side, could be off of the left or the top or the bottom. If there is an OH attached to the aromatic, then that is a phenol. So phenols were really some of the first disinfectants that were used. They recognized that phenols, if you did a rinse of surgical instruments with phenol, that they found that they had less hospital-acquired infections, post-surgery infections. So that's when they started rinsing the knives, scalpels, etc., rinsing them in phenol. After washing them, just washing them in water or washing them in soap or water, that wasn't enough. But a phenol rinse seemed to help cut down on those infections. So then doctors found, if I take my hands and dip them in phenol before I start a surgery, that also helps to decrease hospital or surgical infections. Back in the 1500s, 30 to 40% of women would die after having a child. So they called that childbed fever. And the reason is that you would be in a ward, so all these women would be in labor, 20 of them in a room, especially if this was like a poor hospital. They'd be all in a room, and the doctor would go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. They didn't wash their hands in between. And so when the placenta pulls away from the uterine wall, that is really like a big gaping wound. And so by having a doctor, if he was examining a woman that maybe had an infection, then he went to the next woman, he actually just gave it to her and to her and to her. And so then, a couple days later, they would all be sick. And then most of them would die. So then you had all of these like little orphan babies because of it. So there was a doctor that finally figured out, if I wash my hands, or if I even just do a phenol rinse, that is better than just going from one to the next and like doing this. That really didn't clean your hands enough. And that's literally it was almost like how a butcher would do, the same thing. So Lysol or phenol was really one of the first disinfectants used as a way to try and limit infections. Lysol contains phenol. Disinfectants are really not meant to be put on the body. Disinfectants are to sterilize or to clean, get rid of microbes on inanimate objects. So, like cleaning the floors with Lysol, cleaning the bathroom with Lysol. And so if you get it on your hands for long periods of time, it is irritating. Now you use antiseptics. So an antiseptic, still has an antimicrobial effect, but it's not quite as harsh to living tissues as phenol is. So then these are the last three, ketones, ethers, and esters, these all contain oxygen, okay? So these are oxygen-containing groups, and they're always in the middle of a chain. So you're not going to find a ketone, an ether, or an ester on the end like you do the aldehydes and the carboxylic acid. Ketones are if you have just a carbon with a double bond oxygen and nothing on adjacent carbons. Just a single carbon with the double bond oxygen in the middle of the chain. That is a ketone. Ethers are when you have the oxygen in the chain. So you have carbon, carbon, oxygen, carbon, carbon, carbon. So you see how those look different, okay? Instead of the oxygen sticking up off of a carbon, in an ether, the carbon's in the middle of the chain. Ethers were actually some of the very first anesthetics. So they found that if they distilled alcohol, they could collect small amounts of ether as one of the components that usually evaporated off. They would collect it, and then they could put it like on a cloth and put it over the patient's mouth, and that would actually suppress the nervous system so they would lose consciousness. I don't know if you've ever seen like those movies where like they always come up behind the girl with the cloth, put it over their face. Yes, and the girl's like, whoo, goes out. That's always an ether. Okay, it evaporates quickly, but it's enough to actually suppress consciousness. And so this was the early anesthetics. Esters. Esters are really kind of a combination of a ketone and an ether, because an ester has two oxygens, so it's kind of like a carboxylic acid. It has two oxygens, but it's in the middle of a chain, not on the end. Carboxylic acids are always when you have those two oxygen groups on the end, and ester is in the middle. Most of your fruit smells, fruit flavorings, like cherry and apple, those are all esters. So if you go buy like cherry flavoring, most of those are those ester type of compounds. And I always think it looks kind of like a ketone and an ether that came together. Like there's a combination of them. So an ester is the two oxygens in the middle of a chain. Carboxylic acids are when you have two oxygens, but they're on the end of a chain. Okay, so look at these. And you tell me, let's look at aspirin first. There are three functional groups in aspirin. This is acetyl salicylic acid. We're going to make aspirin, I think it's next week in lab. So in this, looking at it, you look at your card and tell me, can you find a functional group that's listed on that card? Which one? Spell it then. Okay, so it was a phenol. It would have an aromatic ring with an OH directly connected. Do you see the OH directly connected? No. So if you don't, then that means that that six-membered ring is it's an aromatic. Do you see that in the upper right corner? Okay, six-membered ring, it's an aromatic. Okay, what is this? Pretty close. Yes, carboxylic acid, carboxylic acid. Can you see that? Look at that structure, compare it to the one that you see. You've got a carbon with a double bond oxygen and an OH all connected to one carbon, and notice it's on the end. Carboxylic acids will always be on the end of a chain. All right, then what's this one? That's an ester. So notice that's a carbon with the double bond oxygen and another oxygen, but it's in the middle of a chain, not on the end. So that's carboxylic acids and esters look kind of similar because they both have two oxygens connected to one carbon, but carboxylic acids are always on the end with an OH. Esters are always in the middle, and that single oxygen just connects to another carbon. Okay, so here's another pain reliever, Tylenol. So now, what is this? This is the phenol, right? Can you see how this is different than the aromatic? So I still have that six-membered ring, but I have an OH attached to it. So that makes this a phenol. Now go down. What do you see that's different in that bottom group? There's a nitrogen. So you know it's one of these. It's an amine or an amide. So do you see the nitrogen? So when you find a nitrogen, look at the carbons it's connected to and look to see, does either of the carbons or any of the carbons it's connected to have a double bond oxygen? Then it's an amide. Do you see this? Okay, so you find a nitrogen, look at the carbons it's connected. It could maybe be connected to three because nitrogen forms three bonds. So look at all the carbons it's connected to. If any of the carbons it's connected to have a double bond oxygen, then that makes it a amide. If it doesn't, then that makes it an amine. So it's going to be one or the other. All right, and then we'll do Advil, another pain, ibuprofen. What's that upper corner? Upper top? It's a carboxylic acid. Do you see this? Carbon with two oxygens on the end, carboxylic acid. Anything else? And an aromatic. So see this ring I look at the ring, I don't see an OH attached. If there was an OH attached, it's a phenol, but I don't see an OH directly connected to it, so that means it's an aromatic. And the rest of those are just alkanes. See, they're just single bond carbon, so we don't really name them unless they're the only thing there. Okay, so let's try this one. Okay, this is not a real molecule. Okay, I just made this up. But there's 9 functional groups in this molecule. So see how many you can find. So I'll give you 4 minutes, see how many you can find. I don't know why, but I don't have all the hydrogens on this one. Remember, carbon always has to have 4. Those are the only ones I left off. Everything else looks right. Bless you. Okay, just tell me one. Did you find one? Where? Top, bottom, middle, left, right. What would you say? Bottom left? Mm-hmm. So did everybody get this one? So that's an aromatic. It's just written out more as a Lewis structure. But again, see, 6 carbons, single double bonds, alternating. That makes this an aromatic. Did you get one, Kylie?
Is it an alcohol on that side?
Where? Up, down?
In the middle on the right side?
In the middle on the right. Like here?
Yeah.
That one? Okay, so look at the carbon it's connected to. What else does that carbon have? Yes, so look at your card. So you see where it's an alcohol, but that carbon isn't just got other carbons to it. That carbon has a double bond to oxygen. So Vaughn, what did you think it was? Yes, but you're right. It is. It's the car, and I'll keep saying it, so hopefully it gets more familiar, because that's probably the weirdest sounding word. It's a carboxylic acid. Do you see that? So if you see an OH, look at its carbon. If there's nothing else that's not carbon or hydrogen on it, then it is an alcohol. But that one's got that double bond to oxygen, so that makes it a carboxylic acid. Any others? There's 9. Did you get one? You found an amide. Where? Is it this one or this one? This one. You're right. So this is an amide. So see, you just really look for a nitrogen. Nitrogens are always amines or amides. They're only one or the other. So when I find that nitrogen, I look at the carbons on either side. You see that that carbon has a double bond to oxygen. That makes this an amide. But then finding the other nitrogen, do you see where I find this? So I look at its carbon, and do you notice that there's no oxygen? So that makes this a, this is an amide. Not an amide, it's really called an amine. Okay, so amine or amine, either one, doesn't matter how you pronounce it. But that one, that carbon doesn't have a double bond oxygen, so those are the 2 nitrogens that are there. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, we only have 5 more. You see a phenol? Where? In the very center. So do you see this ring? But then when you look at the ring, there is an alcohol connected to that 6-membered aromatic ring, so that makes this a phenol. So that's different from that aromatic. Another one. Upper, this one or this one? That one or this one? Arrow 1 or 2? The first one. Okay, so in that first one, what did you think this was? Yes, exactly. That's an ester, is what you call it. But Easter's fine. If it helps you spell it, okay, or helps you remember it, doesn't matter how you pronounce it. So it's an ester, and you found that carbon with the double bond oxygen, but when you looked on the side, see how it has an oxygen. But how is this one different? Right, so that makes this a what? I heard it. That's a ketone, yeah. So you see the difference between those two, okay? See how when you find that double bond oxygen in the middle of the chain, just look at what's next to it, okay? So I'm like, oh, double bond oxygen. If it's that, I know that it's in the middle of the chain, it's either a ketone or an ester. So all you want to do is you want to look, is there another oxygen connected to that carbon that's got the double bond oxygen? If yes, it's an ester. If no, it's a ketone. So those two are kind of like pairs, kind of like aromatics and phenols. All right, what else? Yeah, very good. Aldehyde, all the way up in this top corner. Aldehydes and carboxylic acids are always on the end. So when you see that double bond oxygen on an end carbon, not in the middle, then you look and you're like, oh, there's just a hydrogen attached. Do you see how this is an aldehyde? And then there's one more that's really the easiest to name, but nobody named it. It's the thiol. See the sulfur. If you see a sulfur, just circle it, if your pen will work, and call it a thiol. Okay? So there's no sort of like, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. No in-betweens. Okay? So the ones that are kind of, and you could put down like in terms of like remembering like ester versus ketone, carboxylic acid versus aldehyde, phenol versus aromatic, amines versus amides. So those ones are kind of similar, and you really just got to look at like what's the carbon look like that's connected to the nitrogen or the double bond oxygen. Where's the position of those to be able to tell them apart? But you'll have this. So you don't have to memorize the functional groups. You just have to like use this to practice so that it gets more and more familiar. So you're like, oh yeah, I can use this to pick these out. So let's try another one. So this one I actually used ChemDraw. I used the ChemDraw in your mastering to draw this one. It's not a real molecule, I just made it up. I was just trying to make it look interesting. Where do you see that? So up here, that's really the first thing I would name. If I get a molecule, look for a sulfur. If there's any sulfur, thiol, check, that one's done. Then the next one I would look for is look for nitrogens, okay? Because nitrogens are either what? Amines or amides, okay? Do you see any nitrogens? Scanning. Okay, where? Is it in the middle or down at the bottom? In the middle. So see, I find this nitrogen, I look at all the carbons it's connected to. Do you see that one of the carbons has a double bond oxygen? So that means it's not just an amine, this is an amide. Find one more nitrogen. So this nitrogen doesn't have any carbons with double bond oxygen, so it's an amine. Okay, so you do sulfurs are a thiol, nitrogens have to be amines or amides. Now look at the rings. So tell me which rings are aromatics, which rings are phenol. The OH is the phenol right here. Right, so 6-membered ring, alternating single and double bonds. If there's an alcohol group connected anywhere on one of those carbons of the ring, that makes it a phenol. But what about these other two? Do you see the other two are just aromatics? See the other two still alternating single and double bonds, single and double bonds. That's an aromatic. That's an aromatic. Okay, so now anything you haven't circled and named, then you can go back. They're only things they might possibly be, really are just those oxygens. This is an aldehyde. You see it's on the end. following along, CH, CH2, CH2, no difference, CH2. What about that? It's not an ester, it's an ether. Right? Because that's where you just have a carbon with two single bonds. It really should be connected to another carbon, but I messed that one up. But that would still be an ether. But all the rest, anything else I haven't circled are just carbons, just single bond carbons. Okay, so there's another one. We'll leave that one. If you've got your PowerPoints, practice that one, okay? See how many of them you can find. It's just another one that I did. You actually have a functional group dynamic study module. They don't have near the size molecules that these are, but these are good ones to go through because what they're going to show you is they're going to show you a molecule with just a single functional group, okay? I don't want you to take these home because you're going to use these on your exam. That's why they're laminated, etc. But this is posted in Moodle. So if you flip to Moodle and you go down to exam 2, oh my gosh, I don't have it posted. Here it is. It's here. I will move it up. It'll be in your exam 2 folder, but it's the functional group. It looks just like this. So you can download this and use it as you go through that functional group dynamic study module in mastering. And then that way you're using this and getting even more familiar, comfortable, so that when you have this, when you're given this with your periodic table next week, that you'll be like, these will look similar. They'll look familiar to you. You won't be like, I don't know, I've never seen it drawn that way. It'll be written exactly this way. Okay? All right, so we'll skip that one. The last topic in this chapter goes over 4 different kinds of isomers. So we're going to talk about conformational isomers, structural isomers, stereoisomers, and then finish up with enantiomers, which are those chiral carbons. Okay? But the first, all of them are called isomers. The word isomer just means it is 2 or more molecules that have the same formula. So you could have 2 isomers of one formula, or you could have 20, depending on the size of the molecule. But it's 2 or more molecules with the same formula. And for these first 2 types, it really depends on how the bonds are arranged. So we have structural isomers and we have conformational isomers. Structural isomers are molecules that the bonds are actually different. So this is that first example. And this is actually the exact same one that we did in lab. So this is looking at C4H10. That's what that is. Sometimes it's hard to see because it looks a little small to me. Okay, 4 carbons, 10 hydrogens. If I put this in a straight chain, then that's 4 carbons in a row. So this is called 4 carbons in a row. Meth is 1, eth is 2, prop is 3. Nope, 4. Butane, so this is butane. Right, so remember that's a 4 carbon chain is a butane. Since there's nothing but 4 carbons in a row, this would just be called butane. But if I look at the second one, if you count, still has 4 carbons, still has 10 hydrogens, but you can see that it's not put together the same, right? So it's 3 carbons in a chain and then 1 carbon hanging off of the middle. So this is called A. 3 carbons would be propane. And this group hanging off is a CH3 is a methyl, and it's hanging off of carbon number 2, right? So it's just the middle carbon out of 3, so that would be carbon number 2. So this is 2-methylpropane. Do you see that they're both 4 carbons, 10 hydrogens? Like you can count all the hydrogens with each one. These are structural isomers. They have the same number of atoms, same formula, but they have a different bonding arrangement. And the kicker is they're going to have a different name. You can't take a butane and twist it and flip it around and turn it into 2-methylpropane without taking the molecule apart. But the second 2 examples are actually conformational isomers. And when you first look at them, do you see that they look different? But when I named the first one, it's 4 carbons in a row, so you would call it butane. Just like the very first one, that's a butane. But if you find the longest carbon chain for the second one, try to write it so you can read it. How many carbons? I still can't write it so you can read it. How many carbons in the second one in a chain? 4. Can you see that there's still 4? I can come down and around. Do you see that still 4? Even though when you look at it, you're like, oh, it looks like 3 and 1 sticking up. Well, it's actually just the 4th carbon that happens to be drawn sticking up. And so this is also butane. Conformational isomers might look different because of the way they're drawn. I could actually take my carbons and go like this. That's still butane. Going kind of like in a step. Put hydrogens, 3 hydrogens on the ends of each, 2 hydrogens in the middle ones. That'd still be butane. They do this little skeletal structure. Notice how one looks like a zigzag. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's butane. And then if you look at the other one, which kind of looks like it goes up, it's kind of like mimicking what the second molecule looks like. But that's still a butane because it's in a row. I could take and do it 1, 2, 3. I could do this. That's still butane. I could actually come back and go 1, 2, 3. That's still butane. Those are all considered conformational isomers because they might look different on paper, but they have the same name. They're just bent around differently. And remember that those single bonds have that ability to rotate. So knowing those two, you tell me there's 3 molecules up here. First thing to do is count the atoms. Tell me the formula. How many in this one? How many carbons in the first one? 5. So it's going to be C5. So how many hydrogens? Not 10. There's 1 up, 1 down for all 5 and 2 on the end. So it's 12. Yep. If you have an alkane that's not a ring, it'll always be, the hydrogens will always be twice the number of carbons plus 2, because you'll always have hydrogens above, below, and then you'll have 2 on the end. What about the middle one, though? 5 carbons and how many hydrogens? Nope. How many did you count? 12. Oh. They have the same number of carbons and hydrogens. I know these are isomers. What about the last one? Same. Okay, so this is C5H12. So I know they're isomers. Now, if I counted them and I only had 4 carbons on one and 5 carbons on the other, you would just say they're not related. They can't be isomers unless they have the same formula. So if I had one and you counted it and one had 4 carbons and one had 5, you could just put not related. You don't have to name them. You don't have to do anything else. You have to make sure that they have the same number of atoms, because isomers, that's one of the definitions. If they don't have the same number of atoms, if they don't have the same formula, then they're just not related. All right. So what's that first one's name? This is pentane, right? Remember 5 carbons in a chain, that's pentane. What would the next one be? Yes, 2-methyl butane. 4 carbons in a row, that's across the top. 1 methyl group hanging off of carbon number 2. The third one, longest carbon chain is it's a propane. And they're both of those. So notice this is a methyl group, this is a methyl group. So this would be 2,2-dimethyl propane. So they all have different names. So what are these? Are these structural isomers or conformational isomers? These are structural. Structural isomers. And you could probably look at them and go, they're put together differently. right? Just looking like, oh, here's 5 in a row, here's 4 in a row, 1 hanging down. Those are structural isomers. Once you know the formulas are the same, then you can pick out those structural isomers. What about this bottom one? How many carbons? C4. How many hydrogens? 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then I've also got a bromine and a chlorine. Does everybody see that? So that's its formula, okay? C4H8, then a Br and a Cl. What about the second one? How many carbons? So C4, how many hydrogens? 8. And then there's also a bromine and a chlorine. Oh, so these have to be isomers. Same formula, they have to be isomers. What would be the name of the first one? Longest carbon chain makes this a butane. Right? So everybody sees the longest carbon chain. Then hanging off of this is a bromo. And the other one is a chloro. Which side do you number from, left or right? Left, because bromine's hanging off of that side, so that would definitely be my 1. Love my pen. It's just trying to change my color, really. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is a 1 bromo, this is a 2 chloro. Or no, sorry, it's a 3. So let's do the next one. What's the longest carbon chain for the next one? 4 carbons. Do you see that? So that makes this a butane as well. And it's also got a bromo and a chloro. So bromo's what number? Which side do you start numbering from on this one? From that left or the bottom right? The bottom right, because see the bromine's attached to the bottom right. So this is going to be a 1 bromo. This is carbon 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 chloro. So that means these are, not 4, Lord. Not 4, this is a 3 chloro. So these two, these are conformational. So these have the exact same name. When you first looked at them, you might have been like, those look different, okay? But they actually have, they're both 1 bromo, 3 chlorobutane, if you put them together. So these are conformational. Molecules that look different on paper, but are just drawn differently. They have the same name. So look at this one up here. Here's skeletal. I mean, this is a skeletal structure, right? So when you do skeletal structures, I put in the dots for you. So count the number of dots. That's the number of carbons. How many in the first one? There are, how many dots total? 8. So that's C8, okay? The blue dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 1 hanging down. So there's 8. So every end would be a what? A carbon with how many hydrogens? Right? That'd be a CH3, right? They don't put those in, but an end, because it's only connected to one other carbon, means that that hydrogen or carbon has to have 3 hydrogens. This one is a CH2. This one right here would be a CH. This one up here, CH2. This one, CH2. This one would be a CH. And this would be a CH3. And then the one hanging down, CH3. The reason is, remember, carbon has to have 4 bonds. So if you have 1 line connected to it, it's got to have 3 hydrogens. If it has 2 lines connected to it, it's got to have 2 hydrogens. That one that's a CH has 3 lines connected to it, so I know it's got 1 hydrogen to give it its total of 4. Skeletal structures don't put that in. So if we add that up, 3 and 2 is 5, plus 1 is 6, plus 2 is 7, 8, and 2 is 9, 10, 1 is 11, then 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So I got 17. And the only other thing that's not a carbon and hydrogen is the bromine. So there's a Br at the end. Okay? I just count the number of carbons. I count the number of hydrogens, count the number of anything that's not a hydrogen or a carbon. Then what about the other one? So go to the other side and tell me how many carbons. 9. Oh, well, I can stop right there. Not related. Okay? So one has 8 carbons, one has 9 carbons. There's no way that they're isomers. If they don't have the exact same formula, you will just say that they're not related and move on. Sometimes they'll be really obvious. Sometimes you have to go through and name them. Sometimes you can look and see that their arrangement's different, like that butane and 2-methyl propane. Like you could look at that and go, oh, like I can see that it's not connected the same, but I know it's got the same formula. So then you can just say it's structural isomers. Sometimes you can like follow the long carbon chain and see that they are conformational isomers just by the way that they're drawn. So we'll do a couple more in those. The third one happens when molecules are actually put together the same way, but because of a ring or a double bond, they become stuck in position. So the example they give with this one is this is looking at a cyclopentane. So cyclopentane, remember, looks like this ring of 5. But when you put a ring structure together, you don't have that flexibility, the rotation ability that you have with single bonds. So if I took like a 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, if I took pentane, which would be this, I could take this pentane molecule and put it in the little zigzag shape, but I could also bend it around so that that zigzag would be like 1, 2, 3, 4. It could look kind of like that. So you can like take and twist it. Single bonds in a chain have lots of rotation. So hopefully lab showed you that, showed you how you can rotate molecules. Once I put it in a ring, now it's kind of like locked. So it's locked in position. So any groups hanging off of a ring are going to be stuck either pointing down or pointing up, either facing towards you or facing away. They end up being on opposite sides of the ring. So the first one that they show you is a cyclopentane with 2 methyls, see those CH3s. So they would call this 1,2-dimethyl cyclopentane, just as a name. But in the first one, if you look down here, well, and it blew it up, like I can never make it do that unless I don't want it to. Can you see in this one, can you see where it looks like that left methyl group is pointing up? So when you're looking at the chain, do you see how it's kind of sticking up this way? And then if I look at the one that's down here, do you see how it looks like it's pointing down? So when I have this chain, or the ring, one's going to look like it's up, the other's going to look like it's down. And I can't make them switch positions. That's different than this one. So notice the one over on the right. See how both of those methyl groups look like they're pointing down? I can't twist this ring and make them go to opposite sides. I actually would have to break this bond, switch it. But the arrangement of the bonds are connected the same. So these are not really conformational isomers. They're not really structural isomers. They are stuck in this position, and that led to this third kind of isomer that they call a stereoisomer. So the words that they use with stereoisomers is if you have one group, whether it's a CH3 or chlorine, bromine, fluorine, whatever, if one group looks like it's sticking, remember the wedges in the dash? The wedges would mean like they're sticking up or sticking towards you. So they would be pointing at me. The dashes would indicate that they're pointing away. So you would put them with this wedge, and then the little dash, dash, dash. That on opposite sides they call trans. And trans really refers meaning kind of like across. Whereas the other one, where they're both on the same side, you draw those, you'd still draw the same little cyclopentane, same ring of 5. But to show the position of those 2 methyl groups, because they're on the same side, you're either going to use 2 wedges showing that they're both pointing away, or you could flip that molecule up and they'd both be pointing at you, and you could use two wedges or two sets of dashes. So I could have it like this with the CH3, or like this. Oh, my wedge got a little out of control. But the wedges, okay, as long as they're the same, just remember you can have two wedges or two dashes, just means that that's on the same side, and the term they use for this is cis. And I always think of trans, like Trans-America means to go across, right? So trans, they're kind of across from each other on the ring. When I think of cis, cis means it's on the same side, like it all sounds the same. So cis is on the same side. That's like literally like how I learned them and could keep the two of them straight. Has always thought of trans as being opposite sides. Cis means they're on the same side. This is really the only ones that you're going to have to name. They do show you like how this can be in a double bond. It's a straight chain, but we don't really name these ones. But can you see that that first one, those two CH3 groups, the same groups are on the same side of the double bond, both pointing up or both pointing down. The one over on the right, though, the similar groups on opposite sides of the double bond are both on opposite sides, so they would call that the trans. So we're actually going to talk about cis and trans when we talk about fats in the next chapter. Fats and oils can exist with double bonds and can have cis and trans conformations. All right, so I don't think we'll have any problem finishing chapter 4 on Thursday. So I'm definitely saying that your exam over chapters 3 and 4 is next Tuesday. Start making your list now of what you're going to put on your note card. I wouldn't start filling it out until you get your list done. Things that you're going to need to remember for chapter 3 and chapter 4 for the exam.